I only had one sandwich left, Charlotte Hayes whispered to herself as she stared at the small paper bag in her hands, and somehow giving half of it away changed everything. The lunch rush at Maple Street Diner had finally slowed, but the smell of grilled burgers and fresh coffee still hung in the air. Outside, gray clouds stretched across the Chicago sky, and a cold wind rattled the windows. Charlotte rubbed her tired eyes and checked the time. It was almost 2 in the afternoon. She had been on her feet since 6 that morning, serving customers with a smile she could barely afford. The tips had been terrible. One customer had accidentally knocked over an entire tray, and because of diner policy, part of the cost had come out of the staff fund. By the time her shift break arrived, Charlotte knew exactly how much money she had left in her checking account. Not enough. Before we continue this story, thank you for supporting the channel. Your views, likes, and subscriptions help us bring more heartfelt stories like this one to life. If you enjoy stories about kindness, second chances, and unexpected love, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing new experiences with you in future videos. Charlotte stepped through the diner's back door and sat on a wooden bench near the alley. She opened the paper bag carefully. Inside was a simple turkey sandwich she had made before sunrise in her tiny apartment. It would be her only meal until dinner. Maybe later, if she skipped the bus and walked the 2 miles home, she could save enough money to buy groceries for her grandmother's breakfast. She smiled at the thought of her grandmother. Even during difficult times, Eleanor Hayes somehow found reasons to laugh. Charlotte took a bite and closed her eyes for a moment. The food was plain, but it was enough. Then she noticed someone sitting across the parking lot. A man, alone. His clothes were worn. His jacket looked too thin for the weather. He sat quietly on the curb with his hands folded together, staring at the ground. Most people passing by avoided looking at him. Some pretended he wasn't there at all. Charlotte glanced away at first. She wasn't in a position to help anyone. She could barely help herself. But a few seconds later, she looked again. The man hadn't moved. There was something about him that felt different. Not dangerous. Not demanding. Just tired. Deeply tired. A security guard from a nearby building walked toward him and shook his head. Charlotte couldn't hear the words, but the message was obvious. Move along. The man nodded politely and stood. He didn't argue. He didn't complain. He simply picked up a small backpack and started walking away. For some reason, that bothered Charlotte. She looked down at her sandwich, then back at the stranger, then down again. Logic told her to finish lunch and return to work. Every dollar mattered. Every meal mattered. Yet another voice inside her refused to stay quiet. Before she could talk herself out of it, Charlotte stood up. "Sir," she called. The man stopped and turned around. His blue eyes looked surprised. "Yes." Charlotte walked across the lot and held out half of her sandwich. "You look like you could use this more than I can." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind lifted a strand of Charlotte's hair across her face. The stranger stared at the sandwich as though it were something priceless. "I can't take your lunch," he said softly. "It's okay," Charlotte replied with a small smile. "I still have half." The man swallowed hard. His eyes glistened unexpectedly. "Thank you," he whispered. "You have no idea what this means." Charlotte laughed lightly. "It's just a sandwich." But the stranger shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." And as he accepted the food with trembling hands, neither of them realized that this simple moment was about to change both of their lives forever. Charlotte watched the stranger walk away until he disappeared around the corner of the building. For reasons she could not explain, she kept thinking about the look in his eyes. It was not the gratitude that stayed with her. It was the loneliness, the kind that settled deep inside a person and quietly became part of them. She glanced at the remaining half of her sandwich and smiled faintly before heading back inside. The bell above. The diner door chimed as she returned to work. Almost immediately, reality came rushing back. Orders needed delivering. Coffee needed refilling. Customers needed attention. By 5 o'clock, every booth was occupied and the evening rush had begun. Charlotte moved quickly between tables, balancing trays and forcing energy into tired muscles. Her manager, Rick Dawson, stood behind the register reviewing receipts with his usual frown. "Table 7 has been waiting too long," he called. Move faster, Charlotte. She nodded without arguing. Experience had taught her that defending herself only made things worse. By the time her shift finally ended, darkness had settled across Chicago. Charlotte collected her tips and quietly counted them in the employee break room. $28.40. Less than she had hoped. Much less than she needed. She slipped the bills into her wallet and headed toward the bus stop. The cold evening air stung her cheeks as she waited beneath a flickering streetlight. Across the city, office towers glowed against the night sky while traffic crawled through the streets below. Everyone seemed to be heading somewhere important. Charlotte was heading home to overdue bills, unpaid prescriptions, and a future that felt increasingly uncertain. 40 minutes later, she unlocked the door to a modest apartment building on the north side of the city. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and laundry detergent. Apartment 3B sat at the very end. As soon as she stepped inside, a warm voice greeted her. "That you, sweetheart?" Charlotte smiled immediately. "Who else would it be?" she replied. Eleanor Hayes sat wrapped in a blanket near the living room window. Her silver hair reflected the soft light from a nearby lamp. Age and health problems had slowed her body, but not her spirit. "Long day?" Eleanor asked. Charlotte kicked off her shoes and sat beside her grandmother. "The usual." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Which means terrible." Charlotte laughed softly. "Something like that." Her grandmother reached over and squeezed her hand. "You are carrying too much responsibility for someone your age." Charlotte leaned her head gently against Eleanor's shoulder. "Somebody has to." Neither mentioned the stack of medical bills resting on the kitchen counter. Neither mentioned the prescription refill due next week. Some conversations had become unnecessary because they both already knew every detail. Later that evening, after Eleanor had gone to bed, Charlotte sat alone at the small kitchen table. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. She opened a worn leather notebook that she kept hidden in a drawer. The pages were filled with sketches, floor plans, menu ideas, color palettes, business notes, dreams. Across the top of the first page, she had written 4 words years ago. Hope House Community Café. Her fingers traced the lettering. Whenever life became overwhelming, she returned to this notebook. Inside these pages existed a version of the future where people mattered more than profits, where nobody was turned away because they could not afford a meal, where kindness was not considered weakness. On one page, she had drawn a simple sign that would hang above the entrance. Underneath it, she had written a promise. Free meal available for anyone who is hungry. No questions asked. Charlotte smiled sadly. Opening a cafe like that felt impossible right now. She barely had enough money to keep the lights on. Yet somehow, she could never bring herself to stop believing. As she turned another page, a folded photograph slipped from between the papers. It showed Charlotte and Eleanor standing outside an ice cream shop years earlier. Both were laughing. Both looked carefree. Charlotte stared at the picture for several seconds before carefully returning it to the notebook. Then her thoughts drifted back to the stranger from earlier that day. She wondered where he was sleeping tonight, whether he had family, whether half a sandwich had truly meant that much to him. She would probably never see him again. Chicago was a city of millions. People crossed paths every day and disappeared forever. Still, something about the encounter felt unfinished. Outside, snowflakes began drifting through the darkness. Charlotte closed the notebook and turned off the kitchen light, unaware that several miles away, the same stranger sat alone in a luxury penthouse overlooking the city skyline, holding a sandwich wrapper as though it were the most valuable thing he owned. The next morning arrived wrapped in a layer of gray clouds and icy wind. Charlotte pulled her coat tighter as she hurried toward Maple Street Diner. The sidewalks were crowded with commuters carrying coffee cups and briefcases, all moving with purpose. She wondered what it felt like to wake up without calculating every dollar before breakfast. The thought disappeared as soon as she pushed open the diner door. The familiar scent of coffee and bacon greeted her. Rick was already pacing behind the register. "You are 3 minutes late," he said without looking up. Charlotte glanced at the clock. "Actually, I am 1 minute early." Rick frowned. then use that extra minute to refill the cream dispensers. Charlotte bit back a response and headed toward the kitchen. Some battles simply were not worth fighting. By mid-morning, the diner, filled with customers escaping the cold. Charlotte moved quickly between booths, balancing plates and greeting regulars by name. Mrs. Patterson wanted extra lemon with her tea. Mr. Green preferred his pancakes slightly crisp around the edges. Small details mattered. People remembered kindness. It was one of the few things Charlotte truly believed. Around 11 o'clock, the front door opened and a familiar figure stepped inside. Charlotte almost dropped the coffee pot she was holding. It was him, the stranger from a parking lot. He wore the same worn jacket and carried the same small backpack. He looked around quietly before choosing a booth near the window. For a second, she wondered if she should say something. Maybe ask how he was doing. Maybe ask whether he had found somewhere warm to stay. Instead, she grabbed a menu and walked over. "Good morning," she said. "Nice to see you again." The man looked up and smiled. "Nice to see you too." His voice seemed warmer today, less guarded. Charlotte handed him the menu. "Coffee, please. Anything to eat?" He glanced at the menu before shaking his head. "Just coffee." Charlotte knew what that answer usually meant. She had heard it many times before. People ordered coffee because it was the cheapest thing available. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying a mug and a small plate with a fresh blueberry muffin. The man looked confused. "I did not order that." Charlotte shrugged. "The bakery delivered extras this morning." It was a complete lie. Seems ashamed to let it go to waste. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Thank you." Throughout the day, Charlotte noticed him sitting quietly near the window. He was not sleeping. He was not asking anyone for money. Instead, he observed everything. The way employees interacted with customers. The way Rick spoke to staff. The atmosphere of the diner itself. Occasionally, he scribbled notes inside a small notebook. Strange, Charlotte thought. Very strange. During her afternoon break, she stepped outside carrying a cup of hot chocolate. To her surprise, the stranger was already sitting on the bench near the alley. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "Not at all." She sat beside him and handed him the second cup. "You planned this?" he asked with amusement. "Maybe." The stranger laughed quietly. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. "You are very kind, Charlotte." She blinked. "Huh? What do you know my name?" He pointed toward the employee badge attached to her uniform. "Mystery solved." She laughed. "Fair enough." For a few moments they sat in comfortable silence. Snowflakes drifted through the cold air. Cars passed beyond the parking lot. Finally, the stranger nodded toward her backpack. "What is always sticking out of the top?" Charlotte looked down. The corner of her leather notebook was visible. Nothing important. A journal? Not exactly. A secret? She smiled. Maybe. His expression softened. The best dreams usually start as secrets. Something about the way he said it made her pause. Most people dismissed her ideas before hearing them. This man sounded as though he genuinely believed dreams mattered. Slowly, she pulled the notebook from her bag. "Promise not to laugh?" she asked. "I promise." Charlotte opened the first page and showed him the sketch of Hope House Community Café. The stranger studied every detail carefully. The free meal sign, the handwritten menus, the welcoming front porch. When he finally looked up, there was genuine admiration in his eyes. "This is beautiful," he said quietly. Charlotte smiled, unaware that the man beside her had just discovered the dream he would never forget. For the rest of the afternoon, Charlotte found herself thinking about the conversation behind the diner. Every time she carried a plate or refilled a coffee cup, she remembered the way the stranger had studied her notebook. Most people smiled politely when she talked about Hope House Community Café. Some called it unrealistic. Others called it sweet. But none of them had looked at those pages the way he had. As though they mattered. As though they could become real. When her shift ended that evening, she expected the stranger to be gone. Instead, he was standing near the entrance watching snow drift across the parking lot. "Still here?" Charlotte asked with a smile. "Looks that way," he replied. "Do you always stay this late?" "Most days." "That sounds exhausting." Charlotte laughed softly. "Exhausting pays the electric bill." The stranger nodded, but something in his expression changed. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice. Yet it felt like he understood exactly what she meant. You take care of someone at home, do not you? He asked. Charlotte blinked. How did you know that? The way you check your phone every hour. The way you glance at the time. You worry about someone. Charlotte looked down at the screen in her hand. There was a message from Eleanor asking whether she needed milk from the grocery store downstairs. She smiled. My grandmother. She raised you? Charlotte nodded. After my parents passed away when I was young. The stranger remained quiet for a moment. You were lucky to have each other. There was something heavy behind those words. Charlotte could hear it. Do you have family? She asked gently. For the first time since meeting him, the stranger hesitated. His eyes drifted toward the falling snow. Not much anymore. Charlotte immediately regretted asking. I am sorry. Do not be. He offered a small smile. Life changes. Sometimes faster than we expect. The answer revealed. Almost nothing, yet somehow it felt honest. They stood together for another minute before Charlotte waved goodbye and headed toward the bus stop. As she walked away, she did not notice the black luxury SUV parked across the street. She did not notice the driver waiting patiently inside. And she certainly did not notice the way the stranger eventually climbed into the back seat once she disappeared around the corner. The next morning, Maple Street Diner was unusually busy. A city conference downtown had filled nearby hotels, bringing dozens of new customers through the doors. Charlotte barely had time to breathe between tables. Around lunchtime, the stranger returned again. This time he chose the same booth near the window. Charlotte greeted him with a familiar smile. Coffee, please. Blueberry muffin. Only if it accidentally appears again. She laughed. Those bakery delivery mistakes are becoming surprisingly common. As she walked away, she failed to notice Rick watching from behind the register. His expression darkened immediately. 20 minutes later, Charlotte entered the kitchen carrying an empty tray. Rick followed her inside. Who is that guy? He demanded. Which guy? Booth 12. Charlotte shrugged. Just a customer. A customer who sits here for hours and spends $3. He is polite. He never causes problems. Rick folded his arms. People like that scare away paying customers. Charlotte frowned. People like what? You know exactly what I mean. Charlotte felt irritation rise in her chest. No, I do not. Rick shook his head. You're too soft. This is a business, not a charity. Those words lingered long after he left the kitchen. This is a business, not a charity. Charlotte thought about the sentence while carrying plates. She thought about it while wiping tables. She thought about it when she glanced toward booth 12 and saw the stranger quietly reading a newspaper. Maybe that was exactly the difference between people like Rick and people like her. Rick measured value in dollars. Charlotte measured value in people. Late that afternoon, as the crowd finally began to thin, the stranger motioned for her to come over. I have a question, he said. Okay. He folded the newspaper and looked directly at her. If someone offered you the chance to change your life tomorrow, would you take it? Charlotte laughed. That depends. On what? Whether it required me to become someone I am not. The stranger stared at her for several seconds. Then a slow smile appeared. That is exactly the answer I hoped you would give. Charlotte opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but before she could speak, the bell above the diner door rang, and a sharply dressed man entered carrying a leather briefcase. The moment he stepped inside, his eyes locked on the stranger's booth. And suddenly, for the first time since they met, the stranger looked genuinely concerned. The stranger quickly stood from the booth as the man with the briefcase approached. For a moment, Charlotte expected them to greet each other, but instead the stranger stepped toward the entrance. I should go, he said quietly. Wait, Charlotte replied. Are you okay? He forced a smile. Yes, just something I need to handle. Before she could ask another question, he nodded politely and walked outside into the cold afternoon. The man in the suit immediately followed. Through the diner window, Charlotte watched them disappear around the corner of the building. Something about the exchange felt strange. Not threatening, not dramatic, just unusual. She stood there for a few seconds before a sharp voice pulled her back to reality. Charlotte. Rick was glaring at her from across the dining room. Customers are waiting. She returned to work, but her thoughts remained elsewhere. Over the next several days, the stranger never came back. Every morning, she found herself glancing toward booth 12. Every afternoon, she checked the parking lot during her break. Nothing. No familiares mais. No te voc. No questions about her dreams. Just an empty booth beside the window. At first, she told herself it did not matter. People came and went. Life moved on. But as the days passed, she realized she missed the conversations more than she expected. Then life gave her something far more urgent to worry about. On Thursday evening, her phone rang during the dinner. Rush. Seeing the local clinic number instantly made her stomach tighten. She answered between tables. Hello. The nurse spoke gently. Charlotte, your grandmother experienced some dizziness this afternoon. She is stable, but the doctor would like additional tests. Charlotte felt her heart sink. Is she okay? Right now, yes. But we recommend bringing her in tomorrow morning. Charlotte thanked the nurse and ended the call. For the rest of her shift, she struggled to focus. Medical tests meant bills. Bills meant choices. And lately, every choice seemed impossible. The next morning, Charlotte approached Rick before opening hours. I need tomorrow off, she explained. My grandmother has medical appointments. Rick barely looked up from his paperwork. Impossible. I have not missed a shift in 11 months. We are short-staffed. This is important. Rick finally raised his eyes. Everything is important to somebody. Charlotte took a slow breath. Please. No. The answer landed like a brick. All day, she wrestled with what to do. By evening, she had made her decision. Family came first. The following morning, she accompanied Eleanor to the clinic. The tests lasted several hours. Fortunately, nothing life-threatening was discovered, but the doctor adjusted medications and scheduled future appointments. Relief washed over Charlotte until she checked her voicemail. 3 messages waited from Rick. The last one was brief. Since you chose not to report for your scheduled shift, do not bother coming back. We are moving in another direction. Charlotte listened twice, unable to believe what she had heard. Her hands trembled as she lowered the phone. Eleanor immediately understood. What happened? Charlotte forced a smile she did not feel. Nothing we cannot handle. But deep inside she knew exactly how serious it was. By sunset, she sat alone in the diner parking lot holding a cardboard box filled with her belongings. A spare apron, a coffee mug, a few photographs. 11 months of hard work reduced to a small box resting on her lap. Snow drifted through the evening air. Cars came and went. Nobody noticed the young woman sitting quietly beside the employee entrance. Charlotte stared at the ground, trying not to cry. Rent was due in 12 days. Prescription costs were increasing. Savings barely existed. She'd spent years working toward stability and somehow felt farther away than ever. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte, her head lifted instantly. Standing several feet away was the stranger. The same worn jacket, the same backpack, the same calm eyes. Relief flashed across her face before she could hide it. You disappeared, she said softly. I know. His expression changed as he noticed the box beside her. What happened? Charlotte looked away. I lost my job. The stranger sat down on the curb nearby. Neither spoke for a moment. The city lights flickered in the distance. Finally, he asked, And what are you going to do now? Charlotte stared at the snow collecting near her shoes. Despite everything, a small determined smile appeared. The same thing I always do. Which is? She lifted her chin. Keep going. The stranger looked at her for a long moment. Then something emotional flickered behind his eyes. Almost pride. Almost admiration. Good, he said quietly. Because your life is about to change in ways you cannot imagine. Charlotte stared at him, unsure whether she had heard correctly. The stranger's expression remained calm, almost reassuring, but there was something unusual in his confidence. Most people offered sympathy. Most people offered advice. He sounded as though he already knew something she did not. Before she could ask another question, a sleek black sedan pulled into the parking lot and stopped beside the curb. Charlotte immediately recognized it as the same vehicle she had glimpsed weeks earlier. The driver stepped out and approached them quickly. He wore a tailored navy coat and carried a tablet beneath one arm. Sir, he said quietly, they are waiting. Charlotte looked from the driver to the stranger and back again. The driver seemed nervous, respectful. almost deferential. The stranger stood slowly. I suppose this can no longer wait. Charlotte frowned. What is going on? For a moment, he simply looked at her. Snow drifted between them, while headlights reflected across the parking lot. Then he smiled. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a cream-colored envelope. Be there. Charlotte glanced down at the envelope. Embossed across the front was an unfamiliar corporate logo. What is this? An opportunity. What kind of opportunity? His smile widened slightly. The kind you deserve. Before she could press for answers, he entered the waiting sedan. The driver closed the door, and within seconds the vehicle disappeared into evening traffic. Charlotte remained standing beside the curb, holding the envelope. Her heart beat faster than it should have. Nothing about the situation made sense. When she finally opened it, she found a formal invitation. Walker Hospitality Leadership Development Center. Candidate Assessment Session. 9 o'clock sharp. Business attire required. She read the letter 3 times before slipping it back inside. Walker Hospitality was one of the largest hospitality companies in America. Hotels, restaurants, resorts, thousands of employees nationwide. Why would they invite someone like her? The next morning, Charlotte borrowed a blazer from a neighbor and arrived downtown 15 minutes early. The Walker Hospitality headquarters towered above the city skyline, 40 stories of glass and steel reflecting the winter sunlight. She paused across the street, suddenly aware of how out of place she felt. Executives crossed the lobby carrying expensive briefcases. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Everything about the building screamed success. Charlotte almost turned around. Then she remembered Eleanor's voice from childhood. Courage is not feeling fearless. Courage is showing up anyway. Taking a deep breath, she walked inside. A receptionist greeted her immediately. Charlotte Hayes. Charlotte blinked. Yes, we have been expecting you. Those words only deepened the mystery. She was escorted upstairs to an enormous conference hall already filled with people. Some wore designer suits. Others appeared freshly graduated from prestigious universities. Charlotte quietly took a seat near the back. A giant screen displayed the Walker Hospitality logo while employees moved around, preparing for the event. The room buzzed with conversation. Then the lights dimmed. The crowd grew silent. A presenter stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Walker Hospitality. Applause erupted throughout the room. Charlotte turned toward the stage. The man who emerged from backstage was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His posture was confident, his appearance polished and commanding. For several seconds her mind refused to process what she was seeing. Then reality struck like lightning. The stranger. The man from booth 12. The man who shared hot chocolate behind the diner. The man who listened to her dreams. Nathan Walker, chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar company. Charlotte froze. Around her, hundreds of people rose to their feet in admiration. The applause continued. Nathan's eyes scanned the audience until they found hers. For one brief moment, the entire room seemed to disappear. Then he smiled. The same familiar smile she knew from the diner. The same smile that had never belonged to a stranger at all. Good morning, Nathan said into the microphone. Today I want to tell you a story about a waitress who shared half of her lunch with a man she believed had nothing. Nathan stood beneath the stage lights while the massive screen behind him displayed photographs from community programs across the country. Yet Charlotte barely noticed any of it. Her heart was still racing from the revelation. Every conversation, every shared cup of coffee, every question about her dreams suddenly carried a completely different meaning. The room remained silent as Nathan continued speaking. Several months ago, I began a field project, he said. I wanted to understand how people are treated when they have nothing to offer in return. No title, no status, no influence, just humanity. A photograph appeared on the screen showing a city sidewalk on a snowy afternoon. Most people looked away. Some were polite, others were not. But one person chose kindness. Charlotte felt hundreds of eyes turning toward her. She wanted to disappear beneath her chair. Nathan smiled, gently in her direction. She did not know my name. She did not know my position. She did not know I owned the company whose restaurants she hoped to one day manage. She simply saw another human being who looked hungry. The audience listened carefully, and when she shared half of her lunch, she reminded me why businesses exist in the first place. Not merely to earn profits, not merely to expand, but to serve people. Applause filled the hall. Charlotte lowered her gaze, her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She had never been comfortable with attention. After the presentation ended, participants were invited to attend networking sessions throughout the building. Groups formed immediately. Recruiters spoke with candidates. Executives exchanged business cards. Charlotte remained seated for a moment, still processing everything she had learned. "Miss Hayes." She looked up to find a young assistant standing nearby. "Mr. Walker would like to meet with you privately." Minutes later, she was escorted to a conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the entire skyline shimmering beneath winter sunlight. Nathan stood near the glass with his hands in his pockets. When the door closed behind her, neither spoke immediately. Finally, Charlotte broke the silence. "You lied to me." Nathan nodded. "Yes." "For weeks." "Yes." "You sat in that diner pretending to be someone else." Nathan accepted the accusation without hesitation. "I did." Charlotte folded her arms. "Do you have any idea how strange this feels?" "Probably not as strange as it feels for you." Despite her frustration, she almost laughed. "That is fair." Nathan stepped closer. "Charlotte, I never intended to manipulate you." "Then why not tell me the truth?" He considered the question carefully. "Because the truth changes how people behave." Charlotte remained silent. Nathan continued. "When people know who I am, they become cautious, calculated. They tell me what they think I want to hear. They treat me differently." He paused before adding quietly, "You did not." Something softened inside her. Because it was true. She had never cared who he was. She only cared whether he needed help. Nathan reached into a folder resting on the conference table. "I want to show you something." He handed her several pages. Charlotte studied them carefully. Her eyes widened. "This cannot be real." "It is." The documents outlined a full scholarship through Walker Hospitality's Executive Development Program. Tuition, housing assistance, professional mentorship, leadership training. Every expense covered. Charlotte stared at the numbers in disbelief. "Why me?" Nathan smiled. "Because talent matters. Character matters even more." Before she could respond, the conference room door suddenly opened. 3 senior executives entered carrying folders and tablets. Their expressions were polite but reserved. One of them, a silver-haired executive named Martin Reynolds, glanced briefly at Charlotte before addressing Nathan. "We need to discuss the candidate selection announcement." Nathan's expression immediately became more serious. "This is not the time." Martin looked unconvinced. "With respect, the board has concerns." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Charlotte sensed tension beneath the professional smiles. "Concerns about what?" Nathan asked calmly. Martin hesitated. Then he answered, "About building an entire leadership initiative around a former diner waitress with no formal management experience." Silence filled the room. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. The real challenge, she suddenly realized, had only just begun. The conference room remained silent for several uncomfortable seconds after Martin Reynolds finished speaking. Charlotte wished the floor would open beneath her. A few moments earlier, she had been trying to understand how a stranger had become one of the most powerful executives in the country. Now she was listening to senior leaders debate whether she deserved to be in the building at all. Nathan remained calm. "Charlotte is not the subject of this discussion," he said evenly. "Actually, she is," Martin replied. "The board supports scholarship programs. The board supports community outreach. What concerns us is elevating one individual as the public face of a leadership initiative without traditional qualifications." Another executive nodded. "The media will ask questions. Investors will ask questions. They will want to know why a former waitress received opportunities that experienced candidates did not." Charlotte lowered her eyes. Part of her wanted to leave immediately. Another part wanted to defend herself. But she knew they were not entirely wrong. She had never attended an elite business school. She had never managed a corporation. She had never led a team larger than a diner shift. Nathan looked toward her. "Would you excuse us for a few minutes?" Charlotte nodded and quietly stepped into the hallway. The moment the door closed, she released a breath she had been holding. Large windows overlooked the city below. Cars moved through downtown streets like streams of light. For several minutes, she stood alone, replaying every conversation from the past month. Then she heard footsteps approaching. Nathan emerged from the conference room. His expression looked thoughtful. "I am sorry," he said. "You should never have been placed in that position." Charlotte offered a small smile. "They are probably right." "About what?" "About me." Nathan shook his head immediately. "No, Nathan, I served pancakes 3 weeks ago. And now people are talking about leadership programs and executive training. Because you earned the opportunity." Charlotte looked away. "I earned kindness. I'm not sure I earned all this." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you know what impressed me most about you?" "The sandwich." A smile appeared on his face. "Not the sandwich. The notebook. Not even that." Charlotte frowned. "Then what?" Nathan leaned against the window. "You never asked what I could do for you." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "Most people who recognize an opportunity would immediately start negotiating. Better jobs, better connections, better advantages. You never did." He looked directly at her. "You only talked about helping your grandmother, helping your community, feeding people who were struggling. Your dreams were never centered on yourself." Charlotte felt unexpectedly emotional. Nobody had ever described her that way before. Nathan continued, "Leadership is not a title. It is responsibility. It is service. It is choosing others when nobody is watching." His voice softened. "That is exactly what you did in a parking lot." Later that afternoon, Nathan invited Charlotte to observe a leadership workshop already underway inside the building. She expected lectures about profits and expansion. Instead, she watched teams solve real problems involving employees, customer experiences, and community programs. To her surprise, many discussions felt familiar. Hospitality was still hospitality, whether it happened inside a diner or a luxury resort. During one exercise, a facilitator presented a difficult scenario involving a struggling employee whose performance had declined because of family health concerns. Participants immediately began discussing policy manuals and budget impacts. Charlotte quietly raised her hand. "Has anyone asked how the employee is doing?" The room grew still. Several participants exchanged glances. The facilitator smiled. "No, nobody has." By the end of the session, people were seeking her opinion, asking questions, listening carefully. Even Martin Reynolds observed from the back of the room with a thoughtful expression. As evening approached, Charlotte gathered her things and prepared to leave. Near the elevator, she discovered a sealed envelope waiting for her. Inside was a handwritten note from Nathan. The message was short. "Tomorrow, prove them wrong. Not because you owe anyone proof. Because it is time you see what I already see." Beneath the note rested an identification badge granting full access to the Executive Development Program. For the first time since losing her job, Charlotte felt something she had almost forgotten. Possibility. 3 years later, the grand opening line stretched around the block. Families stood beside college students. Retirees chatted with young professionals. Local business owners mingled with volunteers carrying trays of fresh pastries. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign, painted in warm blue letters. Hope House Community Café. Charlotte stood just inside the doorway, staring at the crowd through tears she could not quite control. The dream that had once existed only inside a worn leather notebook was now real. Sunlight streamed through large front windows. Fresh flowers decorated every table. One corner held bookshelves filled with donated novels and children's stories. Another displayed community resources, job listings, and information about local support programs. And near the register stood a small plaque engraved with the promise she had written years ago. Free meal available for anyone who is hungry. No questions asked. Eleanor adjusted her scarf and squeezed Charlotte's hand. "I told you those sketches would become something." Charlotte laughed softly. "You were the only person who believed that back then." "That is not true." Eleanor smiled knowingly. There was somebody else. Charlotte did not need to ask who she meant. Across the room, Nathan was helping volunteers arrange chairs for the opening ceremony. Despite leading one of the largest hospitality companies in the country, he still insisted on showing up early whenever community projects launched. He claimed it helped him remember what mattered. The executive development program had changed Charlotte's life. She completed every course, led successful pilot projects, earned promotions, designed new employee support initiatives that improved retention across multiple locations. Even Martin Reynolds eventually became one of her strongest advocates. Yet the achievement she felt proudest of was not a title or promotion. It was this café, a place built around dignity, opportunity, and kindness. A place where people mattered first. As the ceremony began, local reporters gathered near the stage. Community leaders offered congratulations. Employees from Walker Hospitality traveled from several states to attend. Then Nathan stepped forward to speak. The crowd quieted immediately. Many people believe success begins with money, he said. Others believe it begins with education, connections, or influence. I disagree. He paused and smiled toward Charlotte. I believe success begins with one decision. The decision to care about another person when there is no obvious reward. Several guests nodded. Nathan continued. Years ago, someone shared half of a sandwich with A. Stranger she thought would never be able to repay her. That act of kindness reminded me why leadership matters. It reminded me why businesses exist. And it inspired a journey that led all of us here today. Applause echoed through the cafe. Charlotte felt her eyes sting again. Then Nathan reached beneath the podium and lifted a small frame covered with velvet cloth. Curious murmurs spread through the audience. There is one more thing, he said. Carefully removing the cloth, he revealed a simple sandwich wrapper preserved behind glass. The same wrapper he had saved all those years ago. Beneath it rested a handwritten note. Charlotte immediately recognized her own words from a diner receipt she had used as a napkin. Hope things get better soon. The crowd smiled as Nathan placed the frame on display beside the cafe entrance. Some people collect trophies, he said. I keep reminders. Laughter rippled through the room. Then his expression softened. And speaking of reminders, there is one promise I have delayed long enough. Charlotte felt her heart begin racing. Nathan stepped away from the podium and walked directly toward her. The room seemed to disappear. Guests watched silently. Eleanor covered her mouth. Nathan stopped in front of Charlotte and reached into his jacket pocket.